Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. What's your weirdest or creepiest coincidental experience? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. My grandmother had schizophrenia and severe paranoia. One of her major fears was that she was being watched, specifically people filming her. This is a common symbol, so we didn't think it was that strange. One day, we were visiting a large city far from our house, and there was a man with one of those old handheld camera thingamajigers pointed at us. This was making my grandmother quite upset, so my dad went up to ask the guy if he could put the camera away, but the guy took off running. About 10 or so feet into his run, he smashed into another guy and dropped his camera. He kept on running. And after a bit, I think he realized he didn't have the camera because he looked back, had the big face of fear and anger, shook his head, and kept on running. Dad picked up the camera, and on it was about 3 or 4 hours of us walking around the city. Only us walking around the city. We never saw the guy again. A few years later, my grandmother died. This isn't the first strange thing that happened to my family, though. When I was 16, I went to pick up my little brother from soccer practice. On the way home, he goes, "Do you ever get the feeling your whole life is about to change?" This was uncharacteristically weird of him, since he tends to be pretty bro in his daily life, and I'm the emo sibling, and so I said, "I don't know, things like nothing ever changes." And he says, "Something is about to." Anyway, we pulled into our street, and out of the blue he goes, "Someone died." I'm like, what? Then he pulled around the corner and all these cars were parked in front of our house. It turns out our dad died that day at work. One Friday, I was sitting on my usual bench at my usual train platform to go home from school. It was varsity football game day, so I was wearing my school spirit t-shirt. I'd only been sitting there for a few minutes when an old man I'd never seen before came up and took a seat next to me. He was looking pretty unkempt, but I lived in Midtown Phoenix, so there's a lot of homeless people around. Anyway, I popped my headphones in and ignored him until he tapped me on the shoulder. He sighed and started talking about how he used to go to my school name. The man went on to tell me about his life as a kid while he went to my school. As he's talking, I kept noticing more and more similarities between the stuff he's telling me and my own life. Things like sports, extracurriculars, grades, family, etc. When I mentioned that we have a lot in common, he replied, "I know. That's why I'm here." Suddenly he says, "Look, kid, I think you get the point. Don't make my mistake. Stay in school. We're two of a kind, little guys. And if you would just help yourself, you'd be helping me as well. I ought to go. I've got no promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep." From my favorite poem by Robert Frost. Then he picks himself up and walks off the platform instead of getting on a train. I'm still not sure what he meant, but it seemed like somewhat of an omen, telling me to work hard in school. Definitely creepy for me. While visiting England as a tourist, I ran across 2 tombstones for men named James Dixon. That's my real name. I was not looking for anyone named Dixon. I wasn't knowingly visiting places where any of my relatives lived. This was pure coincidence. One of them was in a town of Kirby, Lonsdale in Cumbria. I was staying there for a week because some relatives of mine not named Dixon had arranged a house swap. It happened that the shortest path between the house and the town center involved a shortcut through the churchyard. Once I just looked up, and there it was. That same week, we went on a bus trip to the Lake District, which is a short distance away. In one of the villages we passed through, Grasmere, I ran across the other one as it happened. This James Dixon had been a servant of the poet William Wordsworth. The inscription on the tombstone said that it had been paid for by the Wordsworth family, if I recall correctly. It was in the same cemetery as Wordsworth's own grave. I don't regard these as particularly creepy, but it was an amazing coincidence. I used to play the flute in elementary school. I put these tie-dye hippie stickers on a case so I could tell it apart from everyone else's and scribbled my name under the velvet liner. I grew bored of it a few years later and let my parents sell it to a family friend. Fast forward 10 years, and I'm over at my boyfriend's parents' house one day. I'm sitting on the couch, and his little sister comes in from school and plops down next to me and shows me her new instrument. Lo and behold, it has my old flute. It still has the stickers, so I pull back the liner and there's my name. Apparently, they had bought it off someone that lived fairly close to my parents. Well, 5 years, a marriage, and a beautiful baby girl later, we still get to play on it sometimes. This always reminds me of when you were a kid and you'd go to another grade and you'd always flip to the back or took out a library book and see if any of your friends signed it, just on a much bigger scale. I mean, my comparison's nothing to that, but that's pretty awesome, and it kind of ties the families together. I like it. These all creep me the F out. Seriously, it's 4 in the morning, and I'm terrified to turn off the lights. I'll give my story, though it's tame compared to these, fake or not. So my little sister and I are home alone with my older sister and her best friend. My older sister and her friend are in my sister's room, which is right next to the family room in the basement. My little sister and I were playing in the family room when we heard our front door open and my mom come in and say, "Hey bud," my nickname, or something to that effect. Being the mama's boy that I am, me and my little sister bound up the stairs to greet her, but no one was there. The front door is still locked. My mom is nowhere on the first or second floor. We run downstairs and ask my older sister if she heard her, and she said she did. Her best friend didn't. We left the house immediately to walk the dog and cool down a bit. I've got one. There's a huge cemetery in my neighboring city that I love to go visit prior to having kids. The Black Dahlia, among many others, is buried there. A few years ago, when my son was 3 and my daughter was 1, out of randomness one morning, I decided we would go to that cemetery to walk around for a bit and have a picnic lunch. I told my husband about my plan, packed up lunch, the mom bag, and then the kids, and headed out the door. On the way to the cemetery, my son asked me where we were going, and I told him we were going to go on a walk through a park and have a picnic lunch. I did not tell him we were going to a cemetery or that people that have passed away are buried there. We get there and drive past all the administrative buildings and the main gigantic water fountain. Then we head up towards the top, but before getting there, I take a turn to head past some of the oldest graves, and as we round a bend, my son says to me, "Mommy, do you see all the people?" The hairs on my neck stand. As I ask my 3-year-old son, "What people?" And mind you, there isn't a single living person outside of the car in sight. And my son replies, "All the people on the hill are waving at me." I looked around, couldn't see a single person, and hadn't seen one since we entered the ground. I told my son, "Nobody. I can't see the people, but just because Mommy cannot see them doesn't mean they might not be there. Let's go have lunch someplace else, so we don't bother them." And I basically noped the F out of there. Now I have no idea what my son may have been seeing, but just like I said to him, just because I cannot see it doesn't mean it isn't there. If he could actually see people waving at him that I couldn't see, I haven't the faintest idea they were beckoning or waving at him with friendly or malicious intent. So yeah, that. And now I am thoroughly creeped out. When I was in kindergarten, I went to a small, struggling private school and we had this cake served to us for snack time that was made in our own cafeteria. I had quite the sweet tooth and was not one to pass on dessert, but I just got a really weird, unappetizing feeling when I looked at the otherwise delicious looking cake. So I just stared at it suspiciously instead of chowing down. In the middle of snack time, after hearing something from the kitchen, the adults tell everyone to spit out the cake, but not to tell our parents about it. The next day, when everyone was sick but me, I told my mom I knew it was the cake. Busted. One night, some friends of mine were swimming in a local lake which borders on a creepy old cemetery. They weren't too far out and saw a girl jogging along the water's edge. Not uncommon. She stopped and started talking to them. Being that they were 15 to 16 years old at the time, they struck up a conversation, and then she jogged off. They said her clothing seemed out of place, her running in a 70s jogging suit. She went running down a path, heading toward the main road, where a police car was coming up patrolling the area. He got them all out of the water and shook them down about how the lake was off limits for swimming, bad undertow, and that it was after hours for the cemetery. They asked, what about the girl jogging around? Mind you, jogging toward the approaching cop car, and he told them he'd been circling the cemetery for the last 10 minutes, and there was no girl jogging. Part 2, fast forward about 3 years. One of the guys who was in the lake swimming that night was too drunk to drive, so he decided to walk back into town, only about 2 miles. He was walking on the same side as the cemetery and saw a girl approaching him, not the same girl. You'd have to know this dude to know that A, he wasn't hallucinating, and B, that he'd try to hit on a random girl in the middle of a dark country road. So they strike up a conversation and are talking for quite some time. At one point in the conversation, he looks over to her and she's gone. Got a chill just typing that, as I've heard this story many times. Now you could chalk this up to him being hammered or just outright lying to us for bro points. However, my other friend attests to the story, as friend number 1 woke up friend number 2's entire family about 20 minutes later, as his house was closest from the scene. He was white as a sheet, sobbing uncontrollably and screaming, "Where did she go? Where did she go?" True story. I'm a nurse who used to work in a home hospice. Around 10 years ago, I was taking care of a 27-year-old girl dying from AIDS. She was blind and suffering from related dementia, as well as being heavily medicated. It took 2 of us to bathe her, as she was bedbound and fragile. The last day she was alive, another nurse and I were bathing her, changing her bed, etc., and she kept talking about the man in the room. She was very precise in her description. Reddish hair, beard, older man, wearing a baseball cap, and many more details. At first, we just tried to calm her down, but she was adamant about the man in the room and gave more details about him, describing him in incredible detail. The other nurse suddenly turned white and left the room. I found her outside crying. She pulled out a picture of her as a child, being held by the man described by our patient, our blind patient. He had died 2 months before, obviously older than the man in the picture, but she had every single detail correct. The nurse had never been there before. Okay, so I go to school in a big city, and I always see this homeless man walking around. He never asks for money or holds up signs or anything. He just sort of walks around aimlessly. I see him pretty much every day I have class. Recently, I even saw him in DSW. He looks pretty typical of a homeless man, except he's pretty young, maybe 30 at most. Relatively skinny too. He's never struck me as threatening, scary, or crazy. Anyway, I was walking with a friend down an alley as a shortcut. We were pretty close enough that we can walk or be around each other in silence without it being awkward. So we're walking, and that homeless guy rounds the corner and starts walking toward us. And he's staring me dead in the eye. This goes on for a minute or so until we pass each other. I was extremely afraid of him. Once we passed him, I commented to my friend, "Man, I see him all the time. He's so creepy." But she had no idea who I was talking about. She insisted we hadn't passed anyone in the alley, and though she goes to the same school I do, she'd never heard or seen any homeless man matching my description. That had effed with me so hard since it happened. I seriously considered seeing a psychiatrist about it. Then, like a few weeks ago, I saw him again across the street. I sprinted through traffic, like they do in the movies, yelling, "Hey, hey!" I couldn't get to him, though. It freaks me out. I once woke up from a really bizarre dream. I never usually remember dreams, and the ones I do, I almost never remember great details or vivid color. In this dream, I was looking down at a cityscape below. It was very vast. I had the impression it ran on forever. Yet looking down on it, it looked almost like a map. Just like a map on a Pokemon game or something. I remember thinking this because I was 14 at the time. Well, all the buildings were drab and grayscale except 3. 2 tall blue ones on the top right of the map, and a squat red one slightly southwest. The blue ones were swaying and moaning, and had faces that reminded me of a child's drawing of an ant or maybe space alien, but with jagged open mouths and 2 small black dot eyes. They had thin arms that grasped at the air as they swayed and moaned. I suddenly realized I could hardly hear the moaning. Something else was making noise, something I hadn't noticed until just then. It was the hum of an engine or motor. I realized I was looking down at a city from an airplane. I woke up immediately at that point and mumbled to myself, "Twins," as I got out of bed. Later that day at school, they announced 9/11 happened. I've, on multiple occasions, been able to read people's pasts. I'm not talking about general things either. For my ex-wife, I described her grandmother's house, the color and style of the couch, the color of the paint of the house, how many stories, and the length of the grass in the backyard. I even knew she was afraid of the backyard and how it gave her anxiety as a kid. I described to a friend of mine a time when she was walking past a park in the middle of the night, and another time when she was crying in a corner of her room after her ex-boyfriend had beat her and put cigarette butts out on her. None of these had been described to me beforehand, and I can't explain them to this day. The funny part about this is that I'm a complete skeptic. I don't believe that I had some psychic link that allows me to read these people's minds, but I honestly, for the life of me, cannot explain what happened or how I did it. It really freaks me out. I've never met anyone else to have experienced this, so I'm a little curious if anyone has. Not coincidental, but creepy nonetheless. A few years ago, my ex-friend decided to make a homemade Ouija board, and being a complete F-tard, she decided to put a drop of her blood on the board to make the magic stronger. My ex and I were totally skeptical of all of this, but decided to sit and watch the Ouija session play out for shits and giggles. He was from Russia and half Tartar. So, while he lived there, he was attacked twice by skinheads, shot, and stabbed at various points in his life. Needless to say, living in Russia wasn't a good experience for him. So 4 people were touching the homemade planchet at one point, and the board went nuts and started spelling Russia and murder over and over again. My ex is sitting there calling bullshit, and I'm slightly freaked out. So my friend asks the board, "Are you saying if he goes back to Russia he will be killed?" And it responds with yes. My other friend gets up and goes to the bathroom and comes running out of there, her face a white mask of fear. When we asked what happened, she said she saw a man shoot another man in the bathroom mirror. The bald man was the shooter, and the second man was indistinct. Later that night, we all went to sleep, and my ex said he heard a bang from the hallway, and it woke him up. He said he heard 2 people speaking in the hall when he listened at the door, but not in any language he understood. He thought our friend was messing with him and opened the door to cuss them out, but there was nobody there. He's freaked out by this point and sees that the bang he heard was a painting that had fallen off the wall. He decides to check out the rest of the house to make sure there was no intruder. He flicks his lighter, walks down the stairs, and into the basement hallway, which is lined with mirrors. Out of the corner of his eye, he sees movement in one of the mirrors, turns, and there's a bald man behind his reflection in the dark. He whips around, and there's no one behind him. He turns back, and the man is still there. He said he stared him down until he disappeared. This was a man who never believed in ghosts before this point. I woke up to this manly Russian man clinging to me for dear life. Don't mess with Ouija boards, kids.